Few Enlightenment thinkers are as famous as the French writer Voltaire. Born into a modest, though socially ambitious family, he found his talent for writing early, and by his late teens was punching way above his weight as a playwright and poet, earning accolades and raising eyebrows for his witty use of satire to make not-so-subtle criticisms of church and state. Indeed, he would spend his entire adult life dodging the authorities, often writing under multiple pseudonyms and denying authorship of most of his scandalous books, for which there was no shortage of interest among the literate class of Paris, while the government burned his prolific output on a continuous basis in the public square. In his long and productive life, he would write more than 2,000 books and articles, including several massive encyclopedic volumes. He would correspond with both monarchs and nobodies on subjects as diverse as geology and free speech, history and biology, mathematics and religious tolerance. His fortunes would take him from the Bastille and exile to the court of Frederick the Great, back to the Bastille and exile again. His very name became synonymous with both scandal and genius, and yet, despite his Herculean output, he nevertheless found time to advocate for the downtrodden and oppressed classes, often at substantial personal expense. He would ferociously denounce laws and customs he believed were unjust, and savage his enemies in brutal polemical arguments, yet was incredibly generous to the point of being a sucker. He had an iron wit, yet was an interminable hypochondriac. He was a Frenchman who loved the English way of life, always tearing at the fabric of his own corrupt society. Perhaps more than any other individual of the time, his works challenged people to think deeply about the need to evolve our institutions and culture to be more humane, rational, and accountable. If you want to know a bit more about this genius who stood at the crossroads between the old Europe and the new, then join us as we dive into the life and times of Voltaire, the rascal philosopher. Stick around to the end, where I'll run a list of his most famous and witty quotes. Our story begins during the time of the 30 Years' War in Europe, a devastating conflict that began with the deposing of Ferdinand II, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, Hungary and Croatia, by Czech Protestants, who installed the Calvinist Frederick V as King of Bohemia instead. Poor old Frederick was under the illusion that the Protestant union he was currently leader of would support his acceptance of the Bohemian crown, and he also counted on the backing of his father-in-law James of both Scotland and England. But both the Union and King James were against the move, with Frederick being left high and dry, while the imperial army quickly moved in and crushed the Bohemian rebels. Frederick absconded to his uncle's protection in the Dutch Republic, and remained in exile for the rest of his life, earning the unfortunate nickname the Winter King, while Emperor Ferdinand unceremoniously confiscated many of his German holdings and distributed his titles to other princes. But that's when the problems really began. You see, it was all well and good to restore the rightful heir to his throne, even a Catholic one, but when the imperial army moved into Frederick's estates in the north of the German Palatinate, suddenly the other local Protestant statelets panicked that the treaties they had signed guaranteeing their religious freedom and security 70-odd years ago would be torn up by the empire, and it would use the Bohemian revolt as a pretext to make a move on them as well. It was all the messier because outside Protestant realms, such as Sweden and Denmark, had holdings within the Protestant estates of the empire, while others, who were Catholic, had Protestant concentrations within their own border regions, and they were concerned that these might break off and join their brethren. To top it off, the status quo within the Holy Roman Empire was occasionally rocked by a Catholic territory or city becoming Protestant, which would trigger a sectarian war, such as happened in Cologne in 1588. Moreover, Dutch Protestant rebels who had fought their way to a Mexican, or should I say Spanish, standoff with Habsburg Spain currently had a 12-year truce in place that was just about to expire, and were both keen to get their gloves on again. France, meanwhile, still shirty about Spain not sharing the spoils of Latin America and eyeing off the significant impact that any internal conflict would have on Habsburg power, for the time being, nevertheless played its cards close to its chest. Things were already on edge with the War of the Jülich Succession in 1609, which involved a couple of duchies in the Rhineland whose ruler had recently died without an heir. The Holy Roman Emperor had pretensions of annexing the territory, but so did the Spanish, who viewed the lands as a potential springboard to attack the Netherlands, who in turn were desperate to prevent this from happening. France, again, though nominally neutral, was concerned that any Habsburg expansion into its north was a threat to its own interests, and in any case, they were all for both the Spanish and the Holy Roman Empire slogging it out in a war against their own Protestants that would reduce their power and influence on the continent. So it was that, despite their being Catholic, French sympathies were quietly with the Protestants, despite their own ongoing brutal persecution of the Huguenot population within France. Confusing? Hang on to your bratwurst, because we're just getting started. So, by the early 17th century, the Holy Roman Empire was a religious powder keg just primed to go off. And go off it did, when in 1620 the Spanish moved in to secure the south of the deposed Frederick's Palatinate region. King James, over in Britain, finally responded to this direct attack on his son-in-law's possessions by threatening Spanish interests in the Americas with the Royal Navy. Protestant duchies within the empire now moved to repel the Spanish, only to be set upon by the Emperor's forces, who were backing the Catholics. The Spanish, however, were really only interested in the west of the continent, and tried to avoid getting sucked into the empire's broader problems, because when in 1621 the Dutch-Spanish truce expired, they turned all their attention to the Netherlands, as expected, and the slugfest was now on for young and old. The Dutch and English sent in troops to support the Protestants, but their efforts in the early years of the war were poorly coordinated, and they suffered some serious defeats. By 1625, the Catholics were getting the upper hand, so Denmark and Sweden joined in the fray, mostly to preserve their own continental holdings, but also to see if they could squeeze out a few more German duchies for themselves in the process. Over the next decade, Protestants would claw their way back, and the Spanish were forced to divert some of their armies from their own private war with the Dutch back over to the east to help out the floundering empire at its back. By 1635, the Swedes, who were by now making some serious inroads, were finally checked by the Spanish intervention, which funneled troops and supplies northwards from their Italian holdings, as well as across from their Dutch ones. This whole time, the wily French were funneling both cash and intelligence to the insurgent Protestants, but when the Swedes began taking some serious losses, France finally mobilized its army in 1636 and sent 35,000 troops in support of them, cutting off Spanish supply lines from Italy and reinforcing Dutch positions in the north. When French progress in Flanders and Alsace began weakening the Spanish campaign in the Netherlands, and Dutch naval victories at sea caused civil unrest in Portugal, which was then in an uncomfortable union with Spain, the writing was on the wall for the Spanish, and negotiations with the Dutch began for a ceasefire. The Emperor over in Deutschland kept things going, however, and severe losses were now being taken on all sides as the conflict moved from the periphery of the theatre to the heartlands of the empire. But by 1644, pressure was mounting on the Holy Roman Empire to call for a treaty, with the Swedes, thanks to French support, once again picking up momentum and pushing all the way to Prague, while the French attacked Spanish possessions in Italy, both directly and indirectly through supporting armed revolts from within. Now, in case you're not confused enough, the French under Cardinal Richelieu and later Cardinal Mazarin were doing quite well seizing territory from their fellow Catholic kingdoms and, if you recall, financing Protestant states such as the Dutch Republic and Sweden. But the skullduggery went both ways, you see, because the Catholic Germans, Austrians, and the Spanish were themselves financing and aiding Protestant Huguenot insurgents all throughout France. So let's just pause for a moment to take this all in. An internal conflict that basically started because a Catholic monarch was replaced with a Protestant one, which was actually internally repudiated by other internal Protestants, suddenly flipped when external Catholics piled in. All the Protestants now changed their mind, and were then aided by a number of other invading external Protestants, all looking to cash in on the action. Meanwhile, scheming external Catholics, who were supposedly neutral, were nevertheless undermining their own brethren for personal gain as well, by supporting the internal Protestants against them, while internal Catholics were likewise financing external Protestants to fight back against their external Catholic brethren who were allied to other external Protestants. Confused? Welcome to international politics. And to think that, despite this Machiavellian lunacy, where Catholic cardinals were supporting Protestant princes against other Catholics, ordinary Christian folk to this very day still engage in sectarian violence and mutual hatred. Aren't we all a bunch of suckers? Thankfully, everyone eventually ran out of money, and when the party was over, the French were left with some juicy parcels of land in Flanders, the Rhine region, and northern Italy in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Score! But the Spanish, despite their treaty with the Scandinavians and the Dutch Republic, were still at war with France, and their conflict raged on sporadically and inconclusively for a number of years more, with both sides lacking the cash to make any big moves. And this is where our story comes back home to France. Young King Louis XIV was still a minor, and under the regency and protection of warrior Cardinals Richelieu and later Mazarin. His father, Louis XIII, and Chief Minister Richelieu were formidable proponents of absolutism, which basically entailed stripping the nobility of their feudal privileges and autonomy, and creating a strong, centralized state, heavily vesting its power with the monarch. In doing so, they increased their state revenue, which in turn allowed them to expand their colonial holdings in Canada, as well as modernize and coordinate the army into a unified fighting force capable of quickly responding to both outside as well as internal threats. Their brutal suppression of Protestants at home flew in the face of their alliances with states such as England, the Dutch, and the Swedes, but greater problems were to beset them when their own nobles rose up against them. Richelieu's political machinations and influence over the king were starting to earn him plenty of enemies, but he had by now developed a superb spy network that was the Gestapo of its day. His cunning, and ruthless grip on power behind the throne has been immortalised by writers such as Dumas and its various Hollywood period pieces. Anyway, both the good Cardinal and Louis XIII fell off the perch before the 30 Years' War was over, with Richelieu's protégé, Cardinal Mazarin, taking over the reins of both the French war effort as well as the guardianship of young Louis XIV, alongside Louis's mother, Anne of Austria. Yes, another Catholic, presiding over the French wars in her own motherland. Mazarin and the Queen continued the hardline policy of absolute rule, and the young Louis would grow to inherit his father's zeal for making the entire country all about himself. And boy, did he ever. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So, by the conclusion of the 30 Years' War, we now have a France that, in relation to its devastated neighbours, has significantly strengthened its geopolitical position to become the dominant player in continental affairs. But, as mentioned, internally, France was at a flashpoint. You see, the nobility, whose expensive obligations to supply the crown's war effort in men and material saw them return home as heroes, only to be suddenly hit with huge unexpected tax bills and restrictions in revenue as the war with Spain continued to drag on. The furious nobles, who once upon a time were exempted from such taxes, were soon joined by the bourgeoisie, that is to say, occupants of free royal cities, who were now also stripped of their feudal tax exemptions and bore the brunt of the royal cash grab. Anger at this affront to their ancient liberties fueled first a legal dispute in the French law courts, known as Parlement, and then an outright rebellion that is known today as the Fronde. Spain took advantage of this discontent and fueled the civil war with cash and supplies, such that the French got a serious dose of karma, while Spain finally managed to make some progress in the overall war by supporting the rebellious French princes with their own troops. Princes, it should be said, they had recently themselves been fighting against in the 30 Years' War. The disgruntled French nobles, now very unnobly, set about plundering their own countryside far and wide, with bands of unruly soldiers who were little more than brigands. The whole situation got so bad that Oliver Cromwell, over in Old Blighty, sent his new model army across the Channel to help the royalist forces out, and took Dunkirk as a prize for his trouble. Now, let's just get this straight. A Protestant dictator in England, who had not that long ago lopped the head off his own monarch and was busy massacring Catholics from Dover to Dublin, was now sending Protestant English anti-monarch parliamentary troops over the pond to help a Catholic French royalist army because, well, they hated the Spanish even more than the French. I told you this was crazy. Unsurprisingly, the entire populace was getting fed up with the chaos caused by marauding homegrown princes and their Spanish backers, and began yearning for a strong hand to return peace to the country, even rising up against occupying forces and, unexpectedly, putting up stiff resistance to sieges that should have been easy pickings for the rebels. The result was that by 1653, Royalist forces had not only suppressed the Fronde rebellion, but had completely crushed it, and though the Franco-Spanish War would drag on until 1659, ending in more or less a stalemate, Spain had by now bankrupted twice, and its fortunes as a major power in Europe began to permanently contract from this point on. Part of the peace settlement involved a return of exiled rebel aristocrats to France and a royal marriage between the two crowns, which would eventually become a poisoned chalice for France, but once again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. As young Louis XIV finally came of age to be crowned, he and his fighting cardinal, vowed never to let French aristocrats get anywhere near capable of ever pulling a stunt like the Fronde again. So, he built a massive new imperial complex at Versailles and had all the nobles and the entire court move there, where they would be under strict control and supervision by his agents. Welcome to the era of French absolute monarchy and the rule of the mighty Sun King. The reason for going into this protracted background to our story is to give you a sense of the geopolitical and economic state that Voltaire was born into, a few decades later in 1694. It was a time of paranoid megalomania, political wheeling and dealing and intrigue in which you could fall out of favour with the monarch or the church on the basis of merely a rumour and lose your head for a casual comment or perceived insult. The aristocracy was on edge and nervous to please the king, throwing each other under the proverbial bus to win his favour, while the church, who backed him, used its powerful influence to prevent any kind of religious dissent. The name Voltaire came along much later, but our protagonist's proper name was François-Marie Arouet. He was the youngest of 5 children, 2 of whom had previously died in their infancy. His dad was a lawyer and minor official working for the treasury, and his mother was a minor noble of little social consequence. The Arouet family were initially tradesmen, descended from tanners and drapers. Grandpa Arouet was a bit of an entrepreneur and went to Paris to open a high-end silk and wool business, targeting aristocrats who were craving all things fancy, and with his business taking off, money opened doors to new opportunities, such as buying his son a notary position and a role as an official spice trade tax collector, and later on a marriage to our protagonist's mother, which brought them a coat of arms to boot. The Arouets were on their way up the social ladder, making some influential contacts, such as Francois de Chateauneuf, a future archbishop and mover within Jesuit circles, who would eventually become our boy's godfather. The 2 older kids, his brother Armand and sister Marie, 10 years and 7 years his senior respectively, exerted a significant influence on his upbringing in the cushy neighbourhood of Paris where they lived, where their father had little to do with them on a day-to-day basis, and their mother apparently busy being a social butterfly, dying when Voltaire was just 7 years old. Certainly, very little comes down to us from Voltaire himself about his parents, despite his prodigious writings. He has hardly anything to say about them. In fact, he often claimed that he was the secret love child of a deceased nobleman. Maybe it was just his way of veiling his own family history in a little bit more mystery. We know that he was very fond of his big sister, who always looked out for him, but he never seemed to get on with his brother Armand, whether because of the disparity in age, or as he himself claimed, his brother being a fanatical Jansenist. Now, Jansenism was a religious movement within the Catholic Church during the 17th and 18th centuries. It was named after Cornelius Jansen, a theologian from the University of Louvain in Belgium. Jansenism emphasized certain ideas about grace, human nature, and the role of the Church. They were heavily influenced by the teachings of St. Augustine, an early Christian theologian. Jansenists emphasized humanity's inherent sinfulness and the absolute necessity of divine grace for salvation. They believed in the concept of predestination, which means that God predestines certain individuals to be saved and all the others to be damned. Only those chosen by God could receive divine grace and attain salvation. They also believed that Christ's sacrifice on the cross was intended only for those who were already chosen to be saved, not for all of humanity. To some within the Church, Jansenism's emphasis on predestination led to concerns about the role of human free will, as well as Jansenism's criticism of the church sacraments and practices as being pointless. Critics argued that if salvation was predetermined, it could discourage people from striving for virtue and living morally. Nevertheless, adherents were so desperate to be sure they were among the few chosen by God that they often went to extreme lengths of physical harm, as well as public displays of frenzied convulsions on the ground in a demonstration of their religious zeal, such that Voltaire, or Zozo as he was known during his childhood, developed from a young age quite a distaste for his brother's theatrics of religious fervour, not to mention his hard-line exclusivist theology, referring to him on a number of occasions as a complete idiot. For a time, Jansenism was fashionable in France, but constant clashes with the church authorities eventually saw the movement banned by the Pope. Fortunately, his godfather, the Abbé Chateauneuf, was a more intellectually minded clergyman, and despite his Jesuit connections, had a substantially libertine streak, introducing Zozo at a young age to poetry and plays of a rather more questionable nature that Mother Church definitely would not have approved of, such as controversial works by poet and dramatist Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, and in particular La Moissade, a satirical poem that questioned church authority and suggested that reason was more important than dogma. Apparently, young Zozo knew the entire poem by heart, and several scholars today credit the Abbé Chateauneuf as inculcating the free-thinking and inquiring mindset that was to characterize Voltaire for the rest of his life. It helped that his older brother was a complete religious nutjob and provided a contrasting devotion to what seemed to him a ridiculous theological doctrine. Certainly, young Zozo worshipped the ground Rousseau walked on and made a serious study of his poetic devices and style, which he showed in his early writings, spurred on by his godfather, who often let him accompany him to meetings of avant-garde intellectuals who were themselves pushing the boundaries of acceptable taste in literature. When he was 10 years old, young Master Arouet was enrolled in the Louis-le-Grand College, which was considered the Eton of its day, run by Jesuit megabrains who, again, despite their dogmatic theological position, nevertheless encouraged him to read Latin and Greek classics, and also recognized his talent for writing. In an early example of his humanitarian leanings, he wrote a poem to the Dauphin himself, on behalf of a veteran soldier, petitioning him for a pension for the poor man's military service, which, surprisingly, was granted. His father's connections also exposed him to other influential thinkers who were struck by his precocious abilities and allowed him to use their personal libraries. One lady even left him a large amount of cash in her will to begin building a library collection of his own. As is so often the case, when there is strong social or cultural repression in a society, there eventually springs an underground counterculture, even a resistance, and this was certainly becoming the case in 17th century Paris. The oppressive moral demands and strictures of the Church and paranoia of the state led not only to clandestine intellectual circles that discussed and even published tracts critical of authority, but it also led to a subversive moral backlash where pretty much every one of the 7 deadly sins was given free rein behind closed doors. Adultery became so widespread and mainstream that it was thought that most of the children being born in Paris at the time were illegitimate, regardless of which class you were from. Rumour-mongering was so rife that authorities could scarcely police all the accusations of naughtiness, which created the well-known stereotype of the French as being uncontrollably promiscuous, a libertine epithet that many Frenchmen, and women to this day, consider a badge of national pride. Ooh la la. So it was that a bizarre social climate of outward sophistication, religious conformity, and courtly discretion contrasted with laissez-faire, jaw-dropping, amorous intrigues in private. It was all an open secret, but so long as there was no hint of seditious scheming or threats to church primacy, extramarital relationships were tolerated as perfectly acceptable. Even the king openly philandered with mistresses his entire life, most of whom were already married, and whose husbands typically turned a blind eye, often for decades at a time, if it meant that they were in the king's favour and had mistresses of their own they could turn to.
It's good to be the king.
It may seem like I'm overstating it, but it's been well documented that marital jealousy was insubstantial, and forbidden liaisons rarely caused a public scandal. It's almost as if the complex web of luxury and polyamorous adventure were the French equivalent of the bread and games of the Roman Empire, providing an outlet for a repressed aristocracy to distract them from interfering with the real power brokers, who, it should be said, were also up to their eyeballs in it themselves, and not averse to plenty of rumpy-pumpy. But the king's aggressive foreign policy and propensity to go to war at the least pretext eventually began to drain the country's otherwise vast resources. France had managed to avoid the devastation that affected the rest of Europe during both the 30 Years' War and ongoing Ottoman incursions, and its population was now the largest in Europe. But his ongoing international belligerence, excessive spending, and extravagant, isolated lifestyle had begun to make him increasingly unpopular in the provinces, and by the early 1700s, virtually every kingdom in Europe was also plotting against him. This didn't go unnoticed, and underground circles began publishing inflammatory polemics against the government in greater number, while the nobility and bourgeoisie, now long used to clandestine intrigue, circulated the material with scandalous relish. Such pamphlets and books prompted endless police raids, arrests, and gruesome executions, so, unsurprisingly, most authors remained as anonymous as possible, typically relying on pseudonyms and denial to avoid the noose. The young master Arouet was maturing fast, and his godfather, the good abbé, continued to introduce him to circles of avant-garde thinkers, particularly at his favourite haunt in the old Templar building. It was kind of a gentleman's club where they discussed sensitive issues ranging from recreation to republicanism, Plato to the papacy, the whole time indulging Roman feasts and all sorts of other, shall we say, unnecessary behaviour. The precocious teen showed a particular aptitude for sarcastic humour, whipping up long satirical verses ad lib like a stand-up comedian. The older men encouraged him, but it was a risky game they were playing, and it's clear that he cut his teeth in this dangerous arena, where they were all only ever one wisecrack away from ending up in the Bastille, or worse. It was his participation in this literary circle, with its unrestrained examination of ideas, that motivated him to consider becoming a professional writer. When his idol, Jean-Baptiste Rousseau, not the later philosopher Jean-Jacques, we'll get to him later, visited his school in 1710 to present him an award for literary achievement, he was starstruck and his mind was finally made up. There was just one small problem. Monsieur Arouet Sr., Dad, had insisted on his becoming a lawyer and had even made the necessary arrangements for both his admission to university and an internship. To say he was not amused would be an understatement. He, like many hard-working aspirants, viewed writing as a less than honourable career. But his son, as if to rub Dad's nose in it, had just helped a well-to-do local madam to polish a couple of her own verses, and she was so delighted that she paid him enough money to buy a carriage and 4 horses, which trashed his father's stables and drove him to the brink of a mental breakdown. Despite Dad's best efforts, young Arouet wouldn't budge and decided to prove his worth by writing a tragedy based on the ancient Greek myth of Oedipus. His mentors at the club tried to dissuade him, saying that the great writer Corneille had already written a masterpiece on the subject and that it was too big a task for such an inexperienced young writer. Undeterred, our young contrarian just shrugged his shoulders and said he was going to write a better one. And he did. But not before his father exhausted every possible avenue of making him into a lawyer, even sending him out of Paris, which only resulted in a number of romantic escapades that caused his father even greater headaches. Eventually, one of the aging noblemen in the gentlemen's club took him under his wing, under whose influence he would develop a fascination for French history. He inspired the young writer to pursue scholarly research, which in time would materialize in the epic historical poem La Henriade. This whole time he was hardly a bookworm, though. In the company of his benefactor and friends, he developed a taste for fashionable attire, and despite never being described as handsome, his grooming, charm, and sharp wit ensured he was as popular with gentlemen as he was with the ladies, indulging in the civilized lifestyle of amorous trysts and salon conversation. In 1715, the sun finally set on the once mighty Sun King, to be followed soon after by the unfortunate deaths of a succession of his direct heirs, including the Dauphin and Dauphin Jr., with the mood in Paris now changing considerably, and by that I don't mean grief. You see, in the final decade of his reign, Louis XIV had become increasingly pious and melancholy, largely thanks to his last mistress, who was a hardcore Catholic and who convinced him to repent his sinful ways. Consequently, the tolerance for, shall we say, ungodly behaviour tanked, and the once flamboyant king of parties decidedly became the king of party poopers, with a concomitant crackdown on his unruly and unrepentant subjects. As the next in line, the future Louis XV was himself now still a child, the country was governed by a regent, his uncle, the Duke of Orleans. Now, the Duke was never meant to be in the running for such a heavy responsibility, and was casually raised in the midst of all the debauchery, excess, and indulgence of the periphery of the court. So, when by the peculiar winds of fate he became regent for his nephew, the Duke scrapped all his predecessor's stuffy conservative reforms, released all the riffraff from the Bastille, and turned Paris into a perpetual party central. It was so obscene that Monsieur Arouet, now a young man and no stranger to a bit of hanky-panky himself, wrote how disgusted he was by the whole spectacle, and that's saying something. Egged on by others, he wrote a couple of lewd verses lampooning the regent and his carnal sins, but when the pamphlets ended up in the hands of the boss man himself, despite denying being the author, the young would-be writer found himself swiftly banished from Paris. Aghast, Dad pulled every connection he could to get his son off the hook, pleading youthful stupidity and inexperience, which eventually saw the miscreant put under the charge of the Duke of Sully, who was himself a great patron of the arts, in particular the theatre, and who would nurture a love of the stage in our young writer. Eventually, he would personally write to the regent begging his forgiveness and embellishing his petition with grovelling lines of masterful and flattering poetry. Impressed, the regent relented and allowed him to return to Paris. But no sooner had he returned than he ended up in the Bastille. You see, he had dropped into his local tavern for a pint and shot his mouth off to a fellow drinker, describing the regent in, let's just say, less than flattering terms. Turns out the fellow drinker just happened to be a police spy who turned up on his doorstep the very next morning with an arrest warrant signed by the regent personally, and our overconfident young show-off had just blabbered himself right back into the clink. He spent almost a year there, though by no means was he discomforted by the inconvenience. In fact, the chief warden and governor took such a liking to him that they set him up in an apartment with wine, books, and writing materials, even dining with him on a regular basis. In fact, some historians believe that the lack of distractions actually served to sharpen his thinking, and it was here that he began profoundly studying the classics and taking his writing seriously. He continued polishing his play Oedipus, and it was here that he decided to adopt the name of Voltaire, which some believe to be an anagram, while others think it derived from a childhood nickname meaning little wilful one. In his career, he would use over 170 different pen names, but Voltaire became his one-word celebrity nickname, and he wasn't yet 20 years old. Indeed, while he was doing time, he was hardly mentioned outside at all, and if he was, it was in reference to his being too big for his boots, and now paying the price for it. Nevertheless, he was released a year later, and once again grovellingly wrote to the regent in flattering terms to disarm any residual hard feelings. Despite the relevant comfort of his time in jail, he had become much more serious, and when his play was finally staged, it was a huge success. Indeed, it ran for so long and was so critically acclaimed that it made him a fortune, and even the King of England wrote a congratulatory letter, while the regent had little choice but to award him a gold medal and even establish an ongoing royal stipend. For once, his dad was beside himself with joy, and no longer begrudged the young writer for not following in his clerical footsteps. The story of Oedipus is a classic Greek tragedy that revolves around the life and fate of Oedipus, the king of Thebes. The story begins in his royal city, which is suffering from a devastating plague. King Oedipus, determined to find a solution, seeks guidance from the Oracle of Delphi. He learns that the plague is a punishment for a grave offence committed in the past. Oedipus embarks on a mission to uncover the truth and save his city. He discovers that the previous king, Laius, was murdered on the road to Delphi, and that the killer is unknown. Oedipus vows to find the murderer and bring him to justice. His investigation leads him to the horrible realization that he himself is the unwitting perpetrator of the crime. Being a Greek story, you know it's going to get complicated, so hang on to your souvlakis. Poor old Oedipus was adopted by the king of Corinth as a child, having been abandoned by his biological parents, which just happened to be King Laius and Queen Jocasta of Thebes. They did this because there was a prophecy that predicted the king would someday be killed by their own son, who would then go on to marry his mother. No wonder they got rid of him. Anyway, a shepherd found the abandoned child and brought him to the court of Corinth, where he was adopted by a different king and queen. He eventually gets told by the Oracle of Delphi that he was destined to kill his father and marry his mother, so he left town assuming the oracle was referring to his adopted parents. But while on the road, during a traffic dispute, not giving way to another king, because, kings don't step aside, Oedipus kills the other guy and carries on down the road. Later on, he even solves the riddle of the Sphinx, which earns him the right to marry the now widowed Queen of Thebes, that is to say, the wife of the slain road rage victim. Fair enough, but Oedipus, again, oblivious to the true genealogical situation, marries her, that is to say, his biological mother, Jocasta, who also has no idea that the handsome young groom both killed her husband, in other words, his own father, and is therefore her own son. The revelation of all this unwitting, patricidal incest leads to Jocasta taking her own life in despair and in Oedipus's self-inflicted blindness. He exiles himself from Thebes, and the city is relieved from the plague. The play ends with Oedipus's leaving Thebes, accompanied by his daughter Antigone, who both end up wandering in exile. In Voltaire's version, Oedipus eventually ends up taking refuge in a sacred grove, where he slowly comes to terms with the tragic course of his life. Some of the reasons for the great success of Voltaire's version of the story lie not so much in the linguistic style. Indeed, Voltaire adhered to a rigid, well-established format that would seem boring to many today, but in the subtlety of the content and in its emotional delivery. He introduced a more streamlined and condensed pace compared to earlier adaptations. He also focused on the essential elements of the narrative, emphasizing the tragic conflict and the moral dilemmas faced by the characters. This resulted in a tightly woven plot and heightened dramatic tension. He departed from the traditional interpretation of the myth as a manifestation of divine punishment. Instead, he introduced a more rational and secular interpretation, emphasizing the theme of individual responsibility. Voltaire's Oedipus is a noble character who struggles with his own fate and grapples with the horrible choices he has made. Voltaire infused the play with philosophical themes and searching questions. He explored the nature of human suffering, the limits of human knowledge, and the clash between fate and free will. These philosophical elements elevated the play beyond mere entertainment and engaged audiences intellectually. Oedipe also contained subtle critiques of the society of Voltaire's time. He used the tragedy as a vehicle to comment on issues such as corruption, hypocrisy, abuses of power, and the fair responsibility of humans in contrast with that of the gods. He intended to invoke an emotional response from his audience, exploring themes of love, betrayal, guilt, and tragedy, eliciting empathy and compassion for the characters. The emotional depth and intensity of the play resonated with audiences and contributed largely to its success. But he also made a number of innovations, which were controversial for the time, for example, drinking on stage, dying on stage, and even the display of corpses on stage, which was something that was previously considered in bad taste. But Voltaire pulled it off, perhaps because his audience had become increasingly bored and restless with the monotony of other plays then on offer. In any case, weaving themes of uncertainty, moral ambiguity, and sympathy for villains was new in France, and though Shakespeare had pioneered the concept over in England some time before, Voltaire had said that while he admired his similar emphasis on character complexity, he detested what he believed was Shakespeare's weird theatrical inclusions and a brutish pentameter verse lacking in the strict conventions of French structure and elegance. Go figure. By 1722, Voltaire's father had passed away, and the 27-year-old writer had meanwhile made a couple of useful acquaintances in the banking industry, who helped him with some lucrative investments that made him a very rich young man, even without his inheritance. Thanks to his play, the flamboyant Monsieur Voltaire was now the talk of the town, being part of the dinner scene of patrons well above his social station, but always holding his own and charming them like a magician. Until, that is, he was invited to a dinner party at which, while at table, he instantly recognized the police spy who had ragged on him in the tavern and landed him in the Bastille a couple of years ago. The writer loudly denounced him as a scoundrel in front of the other guests. Unfortunately, the spy was on duty, monitoring one of the other guests, and Voltaire had now blown his cover. So when the chief of police got wind of the fiasco, the writer was later one evening accosted by a couple of apparently random thugs and beaten to within an inch of his life. Shooting his mouth off and then scrambling for damage control would become the standard thread of his life, as we'll see. So it was time to get out of Dodge City, and he hit the road, travelling north to Brussels. Perhaps his close brush with death got him thinking a little more deeply about existential matters, because he now began writing a collection of essays that would come to be called Le pour et le contre, for and against, in which he deconstructed and analysed social norms and tried to make sense of religious conundrums, such as the contrasting nature of God, of humans supposedly formed in his image, and laws that seemed contradictory or even nonsensical. He visited and shared his drafts with the ageing playwright Rousseau, who, if you recall, was himself prone to pushing the envelope. But upon reading Voltaire's work, was aghast at what looked to be clearly blasphemous and inflammatory content, but which, to Voltaire, was just a mental exercise in making sense of the world for himself. The result was nevertheless that Jean-Baptiste Rousseau distanced himself completely, and for reasons possibly of professional jealousy rather than prudishness, poured scorn on his young colleague, increasingly seen by some as very much his equal. Voltaire wisely put the manuscript aside, which would later resurface only to cause him yet more trouble. Nevertheless, he enjoyed his time on the road, where he met exiled English Viscount Lord Bolingbroke, with whom he shared the finished draft of the history poem La Henriade, on which he had been working for some time. The Englishman was so impressed he sent a copy to London, where literary giant Alexander Pope extolled the brilliance of its style and the excellence of its composition. In Bolingbroke, Voltaire found a kindred spirit, and the two men got on famously. The young writer was in awe at the Englishman's broad and profound knowledge of history and literature, his command of several languages, and his love of poetry written in those languages. They discussed together how some words could only be appreciated without translation. Bolingbroke encouraged him to publish the work, but in France, such an undertaking could only be achieved through royal assent, and the chain of editors, religious and political analysts generally ensured that anything controversial, or written in an unconventional way, would never see the light of day. Unfortunately, in La Belle France, there was no freedom of the press, you see. Many writers, therefore, printed their books clandestinely under pseudonyms, to avoid losing their heads. But books, and the printers who produced them, often ended up burned at the stake. Voltaire had to tread carefully. Now was not the time. But having made a new friend, he began to consider seriously a trip to England. As was typical with writers and other artists, Voltaire was always on the lookout for a sponsor, and given that Paris was essentially the domain of women, that is to say, fashionable ladies about whom the entire social scene revolved, ladies were generally the target of people like Voltaire. He would entertain their guests in salon recitals and at lavish dinner parties, and they would provide him in turn with a comfortable lifestyle and environment in which to pursue his work, and generally get up to mischief while their husbands were away, if you catch my drift. One such lady assisted in smuggling contraband copies of the freshly published La Henriade, which Voltaire secretly had printed despite his initial fears. It was ostensibly a history of the country, but focused on the life and reign of King Henry IV of France, who had both Catholic and Protestant lineage and was widely regarded as a decent and well-loved ruler who tried to reconcile the country's warring factions. Voltaire's poem explored themes of religious conflict, political power, and reconciliation. Its portrayal of religious toleration was a reflection of Voltaire's commitment to freedom of thought, which, along with a not-so-subtle praise of England and its bygone Protestant Queen Elizabeth, made it highly inflammatory and caused a scandal throughout Paris. Praise for the English? Sacre bleu! It was around this time that an epidemic swept Paris, and Voltaire was among many who contracted smallpox. A perpetual hypochondriac, he nevertheless survived, we are told, because his doctor literally poured gallons of lemonade into him, for reasons that seem all too weird to us today, but his survival when many others died was probably due to the large doses of vitamin C that he was getting in the process. Anyway, he continued writing, and another of his plays, Mariamne, was a dud, which threw him into a depression, as you might expect of a prima donna who gets a reality check. But he eventually recovered from this wound to his ego and rewrote it, earning the praise of the new king's young Polish queen. Things were looking up, with the delighted queen even granting him an annuity. He was finally in the good books at court, but, as often happens, it is right at such times that things typically unravel, and Voltaire was about to find out the hard way who his real friends were. At a theatre performance one evening, he was in the dressing room with the actors, and a powerful duke, who happened to be visiting, was interested in chatting up the lead actress and made his way to the change rooms. Turning to the playwright, who was cramping his style, the Duke condescendingly addressed him as Monsieur Voltaire, or Monsieur Arouet, or whatever your name is. Stunned by such an uncalled-for rude comment, Voltaire fired back a suitably sarcastic retort, which almost ended up in drawn swords. Several nights later, while dining at the house of another duke, who was once his school classmate, and this evening hosting a dinner party, there was suddenly a knock on the door, with a message calling for Monsieur Voltaire. As he approached the entrance, two ruffians grabbed him and thrashed him to a pulp in front of a waiting carriage, in which sat the affronted duke, watching on in amusement. Satisfied that his honour had been restored, they left, while the other dinner guests, all of them fellow aristocrats, looked on without so much as helping the pummelled writer to his feet. Some even snidely commented that he deserved what he got for forgetting his station. He was, after all, hobnobbing it with toffs with whom one should never forget one's place. It was a humiliating lesson in social status that he would never forget. Over the next few months, incensed by the betrayal of his friends, he undertook fencing lessons, and in due course the offending duke received a summons to a duel, which he could hardly refuse, but for which, through the proper channels, he had Voltaire arrested and thrown into the Bastille again for his impudence. But once again, the governor of the jail treated him well and even allowed him visitors. The whole of Paris high society, which had essentially turned its back on him, were now curious to see what would happen and clamoured to visit him in his cell. The hypocrites came out of the woodwork, and despite their duplicity, the intense public interest in the outcome of this innocent commoner that nevertheless threatened an aristocrat worked in his favour. The authorities now suggested a reasonable outcome was for him to voluntarily exile himself to England until the whole thing blew over. So, in mid-1726, he was escorted onto a waiting ship to spend the next 2.5 years in the old Dart, staying with merchants and diplomats and meeting a number of influential aristocrats, as well as esteemed writers like Pope, Swift, and others. His time in England affected him deeply as he observed the social freedoms, incredible religious diversity, and the openness of English society, which contrasted with that of the French, and he became convinced that a constitutional monarchy was a far better model than the French absolute one. It's believed that he attended the funeral of Isaac Newton, a commoner like himself, whose coffin was nevertheless borne by several dukes, and interred within the hallowed grounds of Westminster Cathedral. To his mind, such veneration for a man of science, let alone a commoner, was unthinkable in France, and he came to see the English enthusiasm for science and progress as a social model that the French might aspire to. He observed that the dozens of coexisting Christian denominations, to his mind, caused a dilution of religious zealotry, intolerance, and persecution that he felt was an ugly feature of continental Christians, both Protestant and Catholic. It seemed to him that diversity of faith was good for peace, writing that England is a land of sects and that an Englishman, being a free man, goes to heaven by whatever route he likes. While in France, the clergy and aristocracy were relieved of general social welfare activities. In England, both had to bear the responsibility for the financial and social progress of the entire country. At the risk of sounding overly cynical, for Voltaire to wax so lyrical about how cosmopolitan and egalitarian old Blighty was should make us shudder at just how awful it must have been in France, because few Catholics, especially the Irish, saw it that way, and life in England was hardly the utopia he often makes it out to be. Anyway, his fascination for travelling the countryside and interviewing ordinary folks was a welcome gear change, but he was hardly the idle tourist. He made copious notes of all his encounters and took to learning the language with gusto, also making a go of translating some of Shakespeare's works into French, that is to say, improving them, of course, as well as writing a few plays of his own in English. He particularly focused on publishing an English translation of La Henriade, which, if you recall, held England in high regard, and to that effect he received a substantial advance from interested parties in its production. It certainly didn't hurt that it was publicly burned as anti-Catholic propaganda back in France. When it came off the press, it was a huge hit, and it made him a lot of money. Eventually, he decided to return home, and when he arrived back in Calais, negotiations resulted in permission to return to Paris. His exile, like his previous road trip, also made a significant impact on his worldview. He came home with a passion for science that he hadn't indulged before, and an interest in outside solutions for France's internal problems. He was a huge fan not only of Newton's work, but also the philosophical writings of John Locke and Francis Bacon. In 1733, he again illegally published a compilation of his notes from that trip titled Letters Concerning the English Nation, which was, of course, a huge hit in London, but in Paris its glowing endorsement of constitutional monarchy and praise of England's tolerant society went down like a lead balloon, ending up on the bonfire as the work of the devil, forcing him once again to flee Paris to avoid arrest. The scandalous reception of his work by the authorities only increased public curiosity to read it, such that it was circulated far and wide, despite the substantial risk of punishment if one was caught with a copy of it. Voltaire seemed to cotton on to the idea that the forbidden fruit was the most desirable, and this tactic went a long way to ensuring his notoriety and fame, so long as he managed to keep his head. Internationally, the manuscript would go on to stoke debate and circumspection among many philosophers on the continent, with some historians viewing it as one of the foundational manifestos of the Enlightenment era that was to follow. By now, at least the hullabaloo over his previous poem, La Henriade, had subsided, and he managed to get it properly printed and distributed throughout Paris. Eventually, people saw it for the masterpiece it was, and probably more than any of his other works before or since, it made his reputation as a first-rate scholar. Circulation might have been even wider, but the management of the printing by his longtime friend Theriot was bungled, some say swindled, though Voltaire would not have a word said against him. This fellow would be an almost constant assistant for over 60 years, though most commentators have suggested he was a corrupt parasite rather than loyal friend. Time after time, he would fail to perform his duties through either indolence or intrigue, often at great cost to Voltaire, but he never sacked him or entertained the entreaties of others to do so. Theriot had helped nurse him back to health when he was stricken by smallpox, and Voltaire was loyal to a fault. Those qualities ensured that it was usually those closest to him that betrayed his trust, sometimes almost fatally so, but he typically forgave virtually every transgression. For a while, he kept himself busy writing, and produced a tragedy called Zaïre, being a story that was set in the city of Jerusalem during the time of the Crusades, and it revolved around a tragic love story between Zaïre, a young adopted Christian woman, and Orosmane, a Muslim sultan. The play explores themes of love, religious conflict, and the clash of cultures, as the two try to reconcile their love for one another with the duties they owe to their culture and opposing religions. As was becoming his signature style, he used these fictional stories to underscore important philosophical quandaries he was grappling with, or to attack religious or social prejudices he felt were indefensible. Sometimes, as in Zaïre, he employed an appeal to emotion, while in others he would turn to satire and even ridicule to get his point across. One of the most brilliant and saucy examples of this was in his epic poem La Pucelle, which was a bawdry satire based on the life of Joan of Arc. Now, don't get me wrong, Voltaire had a lot of respect for the Maid of Orleans and her incredible fighting spirit, but having read a nauseating historical poem on her by another author, he couldn't help ridiculing the constant historical emphasis on her virginity, which, considering the moral laxity of his own era, he lampooned as being of no material use in the fighting of enemies. So he wrote a comical, erotically obscene farce that was so indecent it would make a nun blush and France's cardinals see red. Of course, it was a huge hit in Paris, where gutter humour about all things sacred was the bourgeois equivalent of ribald schoolboy limericks. For some time, the church ensured that it ended up once again on the bonfire, but it remained one of the most widely circulated poems in France for over a century. Now that says a lot. But even here, he sought to expose the inconsistencies and absurdities in historical accounts and religious narratives, using Joan's story as a vehicle for his satirical commentary, pushing the boundary of acceptable convention and poking fun at religious and cultural sensitivities. The work was itself an exercise in literary silliness, but its underlying message was nevertheless a much more serious one, and everyone knew it. Meanwhile, there was some discussion at a dinner party one night about a new state lottery that was being planned to raise money for the Treasury. Voltaire and a number of mathematician friends analysed the randomisation method used in previous lotteries and found it to be flawed, calculating that if they formed a syndicate and purchased a substantial number of tickets within a particular range, their chances of success would be very high. So, they raised funds to buy out a whole swathe of tickets and successfully beat the system, earning millions of livres each. The scandalous win ended up in the law courts, but since they had done nothing illegal, the government had to cough up. Voltaire was now a squillionaire. Okay, maybe not a squillionaire, but you get the picture. In Paris, he was again a government target, so of course he had to leave town, but nevertheless continued to write, corresponding with an ever-growing network of admirers, and one evening, while at another dinner function, was introduced to the daughter of a local magistrate that had lobbied on his behalf when he was still in the Bastille. Let's just say that she was no homecoming queen, but Emilie, the Marquise du Chatelet, was not like other women he had met. For starters, despite her elevated social standing, her fashion sense was appalling, described by some at the time of appearing like a mule in fancy dress carrying relics in a religious procession. Now, normally that would bother him no end, but unfazed, her real appeal to Voltaire lay in her extraordinary intelligence. She was fluent in several languages and knew Virgil, Horace, and Milton by heart, had translated the Aeneid into French couplets, and to boot was a wizard in mathematics. For the first time in years, Voltaire fell head over heels. Fortunately, her husband, the Marquis, was almost constantly away on state duties, but, as was typical, the mistress of the manor was a mistress in every sense of the word, and reports abound of her, shall we say, voracious carnal appetite, and Voltaire was now squarely on the menu. She had brains and libido. Ooh la la. Now, we know from both his own accounts and that of several lady friends that he was no boudoir tiger himself, but he made up for his disappointing masculinity in at least stimulating her intellectual juices. The two could converse as equals on subjects ranging from politics to physics, and it seemed that, academically at least, they were perfect for each other. But the fallout from his letters concerning the English saw a warrant issued for his arrest, so he fled further afield, staying with various sympathetic nobles, till Emilie arranged for him to stay in one of her husband's abandoned and crumbling chateaux called Zaïre in the Champagne border region. The location was perfect, rural and distant, surrounded by woods and privacy, but the chateau was in ruins, so Voltaire spent a fortune in its sumptuous renovation, even building a laboratory in which he wanted to study Newtonian physics and undertake experiments in optics. Emilie eventually joined him, and they lived there for several years, engaged in serious scientific research, publishing their joint studies in academic journals. Indeed, Emilie became the first woman to have a scientific article published by the Paris Academy, while Voltaire, with her participation, wrote extensively about Newtonian mechanics, which, thanks to them, soon displaced the prevailing Descartesian model. They amassed a library of 20,000 books, and their collaborative research ranged far and wide, from studying the regeneration of severed snail heads, a dead end, but nevertheless a tasty one, to European history, and even a critical scientific analysis of the entire Bible. Voltaire also continued with his prolific playwriting, as well as correspondence with ever greater numbers of serious scholars, often exchanging subtle criticism of the French state, which he saw as profoundly corrupt and traumatic to ordinary people. The ongoing burning of his books and persecution by religious authorities also saw him escalate his increasingly vocal and vitriolic criticism of the Church, which he viewed as even more corrupt than the government, and yet no one had made their way over to arrest him. I suppose that tells us how inconsequential Paris viewed provincial life to be. It was almost as if he were exiled in a foreign country. As the next couple of years rolled by, he became restless at the isolated, though otherwise happy chateau. So when young Prince Frederick, Crown Prince of Prussia, sent him a warm greeting full of praise, accompanied by an invitation to visit him, Voltaire saw an opportunity to legally publish his work outside of the strict confines of Catholic French authorities. They corresponded for some time, while he and Emilie moved to the Low Countries, pursuing a property dispute she was negotiating. But when Frederick acceded to the Prussian throne in 1740, they finally met, and continued to do so on a number of occasions. In the young Prussian king, Voltaire saw what he described as an enlightened ruler, one who saw himself as the first servant of the state rather than its beneficiary. For example, he implemented a number of judicial reforms that allowed men of lower status to become judges and civil servants, and promoted a policy of religious tolerance, encouraging immigration, freedom of the press, and literature, notably being an enthusiastic patron of the arts and sciences. So much so that, while he was a prince, many, especially his father, the former king of Prussia, viewed him as an effeminate, useless wretch. His sexual orientation was a problem too. But when Frederick became king, any illusions about his competence as a resolute and skillful ruler were dispelled when he won a blistering series of campaigns in the Silesian Wars against Austria, which marked him as the preeminent military commander in Europe. He would revolutionize the Prussian army to become the most formidable fighting force of the time. He was later to say that Prussia was not a state in possession of an army, but rather an army in possession of a state. Like so many great heroes of history, he was a man of contradictions and strange contrasts. When not busy conquering his neighbours, he wrote poetry, in French of course, because he believed France was the preeminent culture on the continent, and this seems to be the primary reason he sought to have Voltaire become a member of his court. You see, during their long correspondence, he often sent poems he had written, asking Voltaire to correct and advise him on his verse, which he dutifully did with sensitivity and encouragement. This was a golden goose worth nurturing, so our boy V thought he could kill two birds with one stone, when he sweet-talked the French government into appointing him as an ambassador to the king's court, to gather intelligence on Frederick's intentions vis-à-vis the crisis of the Austrian succession. In a savvy manoeuvre, he was earning brownie points back home, while at the same time ingratiating himself in the Prussian court. Emilie, somewhat sidelined, meanwhile returned to the chateau and took on a new boyfriend, which didn't seem to bother either Voltaire or her hubby. Oh, the French! Where would love be without them? Voltaire, on the other hand, during a business trip back home to Paris, met up with his niece, Marie-Louise, having not seen her in a long time. His older sister had passed away some years before, and her own two daughters had been married off reasonably comfortably, their uncle Voltaire gifting them both with extraordinarily generous dowries. But when Marie-Louise's husband suddenly died, the young bride found herself in trouble, so her uncle stepped in to help, and she would remain steadfastly by his side for the rest of his life. Much has been written about their relationship, and evidence has recently emerged that it was indeed physical. Though of course a sin, the Church regularly gave dispensations for marriages within unacceptable bounds of consanguinity, to preserve the estates and fortunes of nobles, for a fee of course, and Voltaire appears to have obtained the necessary approvals. Paris was so full of gossip and licentiousness anyway that it was hardly considered newsworthy at the time, outrageous as it is to us today. He had also written a new play, Mahomet, which was first performed in Berlin for Frederick, but was actually dedicated to the Pope, who approved and even praised it. Trouble was, the fictional love triangle tragedy, set during the life of the Muslim prophet, was essentially a critique of religious fanaticism and manipulation of faith for power more broadly, with the plot merely serving as a subtle allegory of the Christian Church that was motivated by the same vices. Dedicating it to the Pope was his mischievous way of making him look like a sucker, and given the offensive nature of the subject, it was banned in a number of places for some years. Surprise, surprise. Voltaire was pushing his boundaries to dangerous new levels, and was now also cruising for a fatwa. Anyway, his niece, Marie-Louise, would be his charge d'affaires for the rest of his life, running his household, receiving his guests, and managing his growing correspondence library and entourage of staff. But when his old flame Emilie became gravely ill during her pregnancy, with her new lover's child in 1749, Voltaire, panicked, rushed back to the chateau to be by her side. When she died a few days after childbirth, reports tell us he was completely distraught, despite their having drifted apart for some time. Indeed, he was reported to be more devastated by her death than either her new lover or her husband were, who both just moved on to greener pastures. Though she was soon forgotten by her country, her massive intellectual achievements are now being re-examined, and she is finally taking her rightful place among the giants of the French Academy. Voltaire, now needing a complete change, moved into the Prussian court in 1750, where he was given quarters, honours, a hefty salary, and status as a key figure surrounding the king at his sumptuous new palace called Sans-Souci. But it became increasingly obvious that his role there was little more than a poetry tutor and social ornament, and with the king's bellicose territorial ambitions, their relationship gradually became strained, despite Frederick's great admiration and indulgence of his guest. Voltaire's mischievous entrepreneurial streak now got him once again into serious trouble, when he and a foreign merchant saw a way to capitalize on selling cheaply gotten Prussian government bonds for triple their value in the Netherlands. Frederick, you see, had temporarily banned any trade in the stock for political reasons, and when Voltaire was busted flouting the rules, he took it as a personal betrayal and exploitation of his generosity. Voltaire's thoughtless get-rich-quick scheme now cost him his place in the Prussian court. Dejected, though perhaps not as regretful as we might think, he packed his bags and headed for home. Frederick was still fuming, however, and his agents harassed Voltaire's party, even arresting them on suspicion of smuggling out a sensitive book he was accused of stealing. A war of correspondence and counter-accusations went on for some weeks, but eventually the king relented, and the party continued on toward France. Despite his well-known humanitarian leanings, for example, he once lent thousands of livres to a farmer and then completely forgave the debt when the farmer bankrupted, Voltaire was no gentle soul when it came to intellectual vendettas. He was hardly repentant of his scam in Prussia, and when the king terminated his position and his substantial salary, Voltaire savaged the king with his quill, pouring out reams of petty, humiliating vitriol that would have earned anyone else an assassin's bullet. But the king was so in awe of his talents that, despite the insults, he would write to him decades later, and by his death the two were once again reconciled. As Voltaire approached Mother France, news reached him that he was definitely not welcome back in Paris. A number of his writings, in the meantime, had once again inflamed both the court and the church, so he was yet again a persona non grata. He was so desperate to get back that he even visited an abbey, attended Mass, and took confession, which some historians have described as merely a play to win over the authorities, while others denounced it as downright mockery. Certainly we know that when his personal secretary once asked him how he would have acted had he lived in Spain during the Inquisition, Voltaire told him that he would have worn an enormous rosary, gone to Mass every day, kissed all the monks' robes, and yet done his best to set fire to their monasteries. In this case, the truth is probably that he was desperate to access the abbey's massive library, which helped him research a voluminous encyclopedia of history he was currently working on. He got the books he needed, but the authorities remained unconvinced of his born-again piety, so he eventually had no choice but to sell up his substantial property portfolio in Paris and leave the country. In 1755, he decided instead to head for Switzerland, that warm and welcoming utopia of Calvinist extremism, run by fanatical nutjobs, where you could lose your head merely for wearing the wrong style of hat. And we thought the French were fashion Nazis. Anyway, despite some misgivings, his entry was approved, and he soon bought a couple of properties, in Geneva itself, and a lovely villa just outside of town, overlooking both the Rhone and Mont Blanc. He was so delighted by it, he named it Les Delices, and it would become his home away from home for several years. The Swiss authorities forbade Catholics from buying property in Protestant regions, and though he was considered a Catholic, purely because he was a Frenchman, they viewed his ongoing antagonism of the Church as an enemy of our enemy is our friend kind of scenario. He pretty much had free rein, and boy did they regret it. He would soon begin holding parties, which of course were banned, theatre performances, also banned, and hosted controversial guests, critics and intellectuals who would have been arrested on sight had the authorities known. He was also living in sin with his niece, but worst of all, he kept publishing essays, correspondence and poems that were critical of all things sacred. Mind you, that was a hard thing to do in Geneva, which had pretty much shut down all its universities and purged the country of any intellectual and artistic talent. Calvinist Switzerland was basically a Protestant version of the Spanish Inquisition. He nevertheless kept up both his prolific writing and his social life, and visitors travelled from far and wide to see him. He was working on several histories, writing essays on his usual subjects, and corresponded with everyone from Catherine the Great in Russia to Scotsman Adam Smith and David Hume. As usual, the subject matter in his essays and notes ranged in scope from the social organisation of bees and ants to the social stigma of nudity, from the composition and physiology of tears to the nature of divine grace. No subject was outside the scope of contemplation and analysis, to which he brutally applied both his rational faculties and wit. His ability to quickly disassemble an argument and subject it to merciless scrutiny was astonishing even to his critics, who could do little more than keep burning his books rather than refute them without recourse to dogma. One subject in particular really irked him. It was a philosophical movement fashionable at the time known as optimism, whose chief proponent was another giant of the European Enlightenment. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was a German philosopher, mathematician, and polymath, whose contribution to rational thought, mathematics, and science made him in many ways Newton's superior. His impressive scientific and mathematical achievements are beyond the scope of even one of my rabbit holes, but his philosophical works were characterized by an optimistic view of the world and his concept of it being the best of all possible worlds. That is to say, that this must be the best possible and most balanced world, because it was created by an all-powerful and all-knowing God, who would not choose to create an imperfect one if a better one could be known to him or be possible to exist. In effect, apparent flaws that can be identified in this world must exist in every possible world, because otherwise God would have chosen to create the world that excluded those flaws. Voltaire thought it was a smug and convenient argument to explain away the very substantial misery that plagued all levels of society, particularly the poor, and for which no logical argument about why bad things happen made any sense to Voltaire. It drove him bananas. And then, on All Saints' Day in November 1755, a massive earthquake struck the Portuguese capital of Lisbon. The force of the earthquake devastated the entire city, then one of the largest in Europe. It flattened almost every church in the metropolis. It caused a massive tsunami that wiped out thousands of homes and caused the deaths of upwards of 60,000 inhabitants, a third of its entire population. It crippled Portugal's economy and was one of the factors that led to its decline as an international power. The horrifying carnage was biblical in scope, and indeed, commentators all over Europe quickly turned to biblical arguments, making the point that it was clearly the wrath of God. Protestants said it was just punishment, well overdue to Catholics. Muslims said it was punishment of infidels by Allah, yet the Grand Mosque of Al-Mansur was also in ruins. Catholics all across Europe said it was because the people must have been clearly sinful, yet every church in the city was flattened, crushing many thousands of parishioners who were actually attending Mass all throughout the day. This population included many thousands of innocent children. Notably, the brothel district and its entire population of prostitutes survived unscathed, so some said it was surely the work of the devil taking care of his own. But to Voltaire, it was obvious that the ladies of the night could hardly make a living if their clients were all dead. Even the gentle English preacher, John Wesley, dogmatically concluded that sin is the moral cause of earthquakes, whatever their natural causes may be. Every holy roller was chiming in on the "they deserved it" tune, while Voltaire was so revolted that he penned one of his now most famous poems, and later invoked the disaster to completely savage Leibniz and his preposterous, best of all possible worlds idiocy in his most famous play, Candide. But before we explore that, let's just get a handle on the philosophical questions at the heart of the matter. For some years, Voltaire, like many other thinkers throughout history, had seriously grappled with a deeply troubling concept: the problem of evil. The problem of evil is a philosophical conundrum that questions how the existence of an all-powerful, all-knowing, and benevolent God can be reconciled with the existence of evil and suffering in the world. This challenge can be formulated in a logical philosophical argument. Number 1. If God is all-powerful and loving, he would eliminate evil and suffering. Number 2. Evil and suffering exist in the world. Number 3. Therefore, an all-powerful and loving God cannot exist. The problem of evil raises questions about the nature of God's attributes and the coexistence of these attributes with the reality of suffering. It's a topic that has been discussed extensively in the philosophy of religion and theology for millennia. The problem of evil encompasses a broader range of arguments and discussions about the compatibility of God's attributes with the existence of misery in the world. Voltaire tackled the issue head-on in his play, so before we discuss the many controversies surrounding it, let's get an overview. Candide is a young, happy-go-lucky and naive lad who lives in the castle of the wealthy and powerful baron Thunder-Tentronckh. He is taught by Pangloss, a philosopher who preaches that this is the best of all possible worlds, and that everything happens for a reason. Most commentators generally agree that Pangloss is more or less an avatar of the real-life Leibniz. Now, young Candide falls in love with the baron's daughter, Cunegonde, and the two get jiggy with it, thinking nothing of it, because Pangloss, their teacher, was also indulging in some hanky-panky of his own. But it seems those liberties didn't extend to Candide, and he gets booted from the castle for deflowering the princess. Wandering in poverty, he gets captured by Bulgarian, read Prussian, soldiers, and is drafted against his will to go to war. Witnessing all sorts of carnage and suffering, he manages to escape and ends up in Holland, where he meets a dissenting Protestant merchant called Jacques, who helps him recover both physically and emotionally. He surprisingly happens to come across his old teacher Pangloss, who is now disfigured and dying of syphilis, and who relates that both the baron back home and Cunegonde, who it turns out is actually his cousin, had died in the wars. Still, Pangloss, despite his afflictions, remains Buddhistically philosophical that all is as it should be. Despite the teacher's increasingly idiotic fatalistic acceptance, Jacques manages, nevertheless, to cure him of his illness, and the three of them decide to board a ship, and as they sail out, a storm causes it to sink, in which Jacques the merchant rescues a drowning sailor, but is himself thrown overboard and drowns, while the now rescued sailor simply looks on without helping him in turn. Pangloss, despite the unfairness of the situation, again consoles the grieving Candide that all is as it should be, and when they eventually wash up, fortuitously on the Lisbon shore, a massive earthquake suddenly hits and levels the entire city. The previously rescued sailor, who, as we know, lacks a conscience, now rushes off to participate in some profitable looting, while Pangloss keeps yapping on about how all this is perfectly fine and normal. Unfortunately, our survivors run into a couple of padres from the Spanish, or rather Portuguese, Inquisition, who take umbrage with all of Pangloss's yammering, have them tortured, and prepare them to meet their maker at the end of a noose. Pangloss gets done in, but somehow survives. Candide miraculously runs into Cunegonde, who apparently also survived the unsurvivable, along with a litany of other typical horrors that women face during the lawlessness of war. Happy to be reunited, they hit the high seas again and head for South America, because there's gold in them thar hills. At length they land in Buenos Aires, and after doing the tango with local angry Spanish authorities, Candide bails out on his lovey/cousin Cunegonde
Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn.
And heads into the jungles searching for El Dorado. He experiences all sorts of weird and wacky adventures, but misses his missus, so a servant heads back to collect her, promising to rendezvous with him back in Europe. Candide's eventual crossing takes him to France and then, of course, to England, where he witnesses an admiral being shot in front of his troops. We are told, says his friend, that the British find it necessary to shoot their admirals from time to time to encourage the others. I'll just detour into a little baby rabbit hole for a second. This was most likely a reference to the execution of Admiral John Byng, who failed to relieve a British garrison in Minorca, then under siege by the French in 1756 during the 7 Years' War. Despite the impossible nature of his task and the support of many of his senior officers for the decision to not engage the enemy, he was court-martialed anyway for not doing his utmost, and shot by firing squad in front of his crew. Clearly, it was somewhat of an international scandal for Voltaire to be so affected by it that he included it in his play. To this very day, the unfortunate admiral remains without so much as a pardon, let alone exoneration. Anyway, Candide figures it's time to move on, and ends up in Republican Venice, wining and dining with the who's who of Venetian high society, as well as a bunch of exiles from other lands who had taken refuge there. He eventually receives news that Cunegonde, far from making it to Europe, has actually ended up in Constantinople, and is now a dishwasher slave and apparently also very ugly. But true love is true love, don't you know, so he hightails it out to meet up with her, but lo and behold, runs into Pangloss again, who is not only very much alive, but is actually a galley slave, albeit still a rather nauseatingly upbeat one. They eventually meet up with his lovey, buy her freedom, and the ragtag rabble of adventurers, all the worse for wear and barely having survived the ordeals they faced, decide to settle down, becoming farmers to live a humble working life. They occasionally consult various wise men on the issue of suffering and the central problem of evil, the consensus seeming to be that we can't possibly know what the big plan is, and that we should just focus on doing the little things as best we can. The end. When Voltaire eventually published it, under yet another pseudonym, it was clear that he had basically pooh-poohed every single religious and secular organization there was to offend, to the point that he insulted the aristocrats of multiple nations and libelled dozens of other powerful individuals as either idiots or miscreants. Unsurprisingly, it went straight onto the bonfires again, wherever copies were discovered, and though for years he denied being its author, there was no mistaking his being its mastermind. Of course, the public loved it, and it spread like wildfire, being the subject of scandalous talk at dinner parties for decades. More seriously, though, scholars today still debate whether it was a justifiable critique of the philosophy of optimism, because he doesn't really give us any credible arguments of his own, besides ridicule, basically only making the obvious statement that bad things happen to good people, a lot, without actually addressing the why, something that Leibniz at least made a go of. Plenty of critics, both contemporary and later, have made a proper criticism of Leibnizian optimism, including Bayle, Kant, Schopenhauer, and even Nietzsche, while Voltaire was, as usual, more interested in just rubbing Leibniz's nose in it. Think George Carlin, but with a wig and tricorn. It may be that Voltaire's perception of optimism was that it was a religious cop-out argument that served more to maintain the current social order, and therefore perpetuated the misery of ordinary people, than it was a credible explanation of how the world works. In that sense, his criticism can be taken as a political one rather than a philosophical one. Voltaire was a progressive who certainly believed that positive change had to be strived for, not just left up to divine providence. To him, such fatalism merely served to reinforce the status quo, rather than drive actual practical solutions, which lay in the realms of science and free inquiry. It may be that the surprisingly anticlimactic ending of the story, where they all just decide to become simple farmers, says more about taking action in whatever small way one can, that is to say, cultivating the best garden you can, rather than just hoping that God will provide a good crop, is what he was really aiming for in the play. While he was busy working on Candide, he nevertheless found time to finish his magnum opus, Essays on the Manners of the Spirit of Nations, which was nothing less than an attempt at a comprehensive history of mankind, ranging in breadth from China to Scotland, from medieval art to the English Civil War, from a history of Persia to the rise of the papacy, ancient Egypt to the story of Saladin, all the while weaving the thread of his pet subjects of religious tolerance and injustice. We might consider it an audacious and silly attempt, but for its time it was incredibly in-depth and had taken him decades of painstaking research to put together, and it had an enormous effect on the scholars that followed. It was around this time that he read a rebuke of his poem on the Lisbon earthquake, written by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I told you we'd get to him eventually. The relationship between Voltaire and Rousseau was complex and marked by a mixture of admiration, collaboration, and eventual conflict. Young Rousseau initially looked up to Voltaire as a literary figure and philosopher. He sent a copy of his work, Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, to Voltaire seeking his opinion. The older writer, impressed by the work, responded positively, and this marked the beginning of their correspondence. They exchanged letters discussing literature, philosophy, and their shared commitment to Enlightenment ideals. They also shared critiques of social institutions, including organized religion and political authority. Both Voltaire and Rousseau contributed articles to Denis Diderot's Encyclopedia, a monumental work of Enlightenment thought. Their collaboration on this project demonstrated their shared interest in advancing human knowledge and challenging traditional norms. Despite their initially friendly interactions, fundamental differences in their personalities, beliefs, and approaches gradually led to tension. Rousseau was more emotionally driven and focused on authenticity, while Voltaire was known for his wit, sarcasm, and rationalism. Rousseau was commissioned by an aggrieved Genevan pastor to write a rebuttal to Voltaire's essentially pessimistic Lisbon earthquake poem, and filled it with what seems to us such unworthy nonsense as the tragedy having been entirely the Lisboans' own fault. He wrote that if they had lived in the woods and fields, instead of being crammed inside tall, poorly built cities, they would not have died in the earthquake, so doom on them. Scholars today suggest that it is one of the earliest attempts at looking at disasters through the prism of social science and cultural vulnerability, rather than the purely moralistic arguments about blame. It was kind of a middle way and made Voltaire's blood boil. He never replied, but Rousseau would later go on to say that Candide was his answer to it. In time, Rousseau accused Voltaire of trying to maliciously block publication of his book, The New Héloïse, which he didn't, but Rousseau was convinced and began publicly smearing him all the same. Hell hath no fury like an emo with a grudge. While they nevertheless had many visions in common, their differences culminated in a public dispute over the question of whether civilization or the state of nature is more conducive to human happiness. Rousseau, in his famous polemic, "All men are born free but are everywhere in chains," argued for the virtues of the natural state, while Voltaire criticised Rousseau's romanticisation of nature and expressed scepticism about the benefits of a return to a primitive state. Today's conservatives would argue that man is in fact not born free. We are actually completely helpless and dependent on the goodwill and cooperation of adults, and by extension, the culture we live in, to protect and help us to thrive until we become self-sufficient. Anyway, the flurry of correspondence eventually got rather nasty, and Rousseau felt so besieged by Voltaire's greater social influence that he gradually sulkingly withdrew from intellectual circles. Now, with all this excitement going on, we shouldn't forget that the Swiss fun police were getting increasingly antsy, so much so that Voltaire felt if he didn't leave, he might actually be arrested. He wasn't particularly scared of yet another public scandal. In fact, it seems he saw bad press as just another form of advertising. It's just that he believed his delicate constitution wouldn't survive another spell in jail. The whole time he was in Switzerland, he was, of course, convinced he was dying from one imaginary affliction after another. So he began looking around for a new home, remarking that had he not been so prone to seasickness, he would have travelled over to Philadelphia to live among the American Quakers, who were no doubt relieved to have got off the hook. Instead, he settled on purchasing a rambling and ruinous estate just across the border back in France, at Ferney, which conferred on him an automatic title of Count. As usual, he vigorously set about rebuilding his chateau, but also witnessed the appalling poverty and distress of the local villagers, who were still serfs and under the yoke of both ecclesiastical and government overlords. He rebuilt fences, roads, vineyards, and built both a lace and watchmaking factory, which employed dozens of Protestant and Catholic workers who, till then, had been forced to remain segregated. He granted cheap loans to local farmers and rebuilt damaged infrastructure, new village housing, even building a new church from the remains of a ruined one for the benefit of locals. The surrounding toffs were all rather annoyed at all this progress, and occasionally took both him and the villagers to court on trumped-up tax violations, millions of francs of which he paid on behalf of villagers out of his own pocket. He had tried to be the kind of beneficent ruler that he had hoped Frederick, Catherine, and other monarchs would be, and the ordinary people loved him for it, flocking from far and wide to live there. Despite his little project at Ferney actually becoming a profitable enterprise, few others bothered to emulate it, and the estate remained a curiosity rather than the template he had wished it to be. He was, of course, writing the whole time, and his new play, Tancred, was hailed as a masterpiece by luminaries such as Diderot and even Lord Byron over in England. By 1761, he was well settled on his new estate when word reached him of a shocking event that would go on to cement his reputation as one of the greatest humanists of his age. Now, it's clear that life in France was pretty awful even for the average Catholic, but for Protestants it was completely unbearable, especially in the deep south, where they were barred from public office and from key professions, or even ordinary trades like bookseller, goldsmith, or grocer. Marriage by Protestant ministers was considered invalid, and the children of such unions illegitimate. Protestant families were subject to draconian punishments and fines simply for practicing their faith, and were often killed in the streets by fanatics. There was a lot of pressure on people to convert, and many did, some purely out of convenience, and reports abound about many Catholic priests issuing certificates of conversion, for a nominal fee, of course. So it was that the eldest son of one Monsieur Jean Calas, a draper from Toulouse, had tried to escape the dead-end life of a Protestant by seeking to obtain one such conversion certificate. But the local parish priest was not up for a bribe, and demanded instead a written testimony of faith rather than cash. To pay a bribe was one thing, but to betray his true beliefs in cold ink was just more than he could bear to do. Now, Monsieur Calas' younger son did indeed convert, and the father faced the reality of it even though he didn't like it. But the older one wasn't going to budge, and instead strung himself up one night in despair. It was bad enough to lose a child in such a horrible way, but when locals began accusing the father of murder, things began to get really dark. Murmurs had begun that the boy was looking to convert, and that the father surely did him in out of rage. Local religious fanatics were baying for blood, and a kangaroo court convicted the entire family, including their maid, of complicity in the murder, and they were sentenced to death. An appeal brought the mother a stay of execution, and the maid got life in servitude, but the father ended up on the rack, slowly tortured to death while screaming his innocence to his dying breath. The youngest son had meanwhile fled and came to the famous Voltaire to plead for aid, and when he told him the whole story, Voltaire was outraged and vowed to assist. He swung into action, calling on acquaintances from far and wide, which now numbered thousands of people with connections in high places. Eventually, he managed to initiate a Crown inquiry into the conduct of the trial. The local magistrates and religious prosecutors were stunned as the High Court subpoenaed all their files. It turns out that the king himself had now heard of the case and agreed that something must be done. Voltaire paid for the entire inquest, lawyers' fees and court costs, which were substantial. In 1763, a year after Calas' unjust execution, the King's Council of over 80 ministers sat to consider the case, an unprecedented gathering for the sake of a commoner, and they unanimously concluded that the trial was deeply flawed and that the verdict should be annulled. The whole of Paris, gripped by the drama, erupted into celebration at the declaration of Jean Calas' innocence. His hapless widow was given a compensation by the Crown, and other indicted individuals were also released and compensated. Voltaire was now a hero without comparison and a beloved champion of the little guy. As you can imagine, a flurry of similarly heart-wrenching miscarriages of justice bombarded him, and he again acquitted a number of them in similar dramatic and public fashion. Too many to recount them all here, but his experience in these matters strengthened his resolve to continue battering at the door of religious intolerance and judicial fairness, most eloquently expressed in his Treatise on Toleration, finished shortly after the inquiry. In this essay, Voltaire argued for religious tolerance, advocating for the separation of church and state. He criticized religious persecution, fanaticism, and the abuses of religious authority. The treatise influenced the development of the concept of religious freedom, which became a cornerstone of modern liberal thought. But, yet again, the powers that be were horrified and burned it with indignation. Now, it's clear that Voltaire had a grudge against the Church, but it would be wrong to assume he was an atheist. Like increasing numbers of other intellectuals of the period, he found it hard to reconcile a petitionable, interventionist and loving paternal God with the misery and disease that was the basic human condition pretty much everywhere. He openly admitted to believing in God, even becoming a Freemason, for whom it was an essential prerequisite. but he felt that anything that went beyond the simple adoration of a supreme creator being was entering murky territory, so, ironically, he himself took the expedient view of the deist position, which was that the entirety of creation was indeed the product of an omnipotent creator, who wound up, as it were, the clockwork universe he had built, and then stepped away and let it run without any further intervention. Deism became increasingly fashionable among educated skeptics, who saw the need to separate church and state and allow progress to carry on unfettered by what they felt was religious inertia. It was rather popular among many of the founding fathers of the American colonies. Physically, Voltaire's health began to decline through the late 1760s. For real this time. And he spent much of his time in bed, even receiving visitors to his bedchamber. As usual, he was convinced he was going to expire at any moment, but visitors kept coming from far and wide to pay him tribute, and how he managed to keep up his frenetic pace of writing yet more plays, dictionaries, collected works and letters, all while exchanging polite chit-chat with adoring fans, is simply astonishing. He even had time to sit for a sculptor, but insisted not on the usual heroic muscular posture, but instead on showing his now frail and bony frame with all its mortal flaws, and more or less nude to boot. You gotta love the guy. By the 1770s, he was in his 80s and had been away from Paris for decades, but still desperate to return. When King Louis XV died in 1774, he hoped there might be a chance, but Louis XVI despised him even more than his predecessor. Nevertheless, when he finished his final play, Irene, which was set to debut in Paris, the king turned a blind eye, and the aging polymath was welcomed into the city with great pomp and public celebration. The play was a great success, though perhaps not his finest work, but the intense public scrutiny and hordes of visitors finally took their toll on his health as he gradually withered away from kidney failure. Ever the satirist through and through, supposedly, when he was visited on his deathbed by a chaplain performing the last rites, and who asked him to renounce Satan, Voltaire looked up at him with a twinkle in his eye and said, Now, my good man, this is no time to be making enemies." A wise Alec to his dying breath. A couple of days later he was gone, and Paris went into mourning. But the story doesn't end there. You see, the church authorities still had it in for him, and there was no way they were going to approve a religious funeral, or burial in hallowed ground. Such an apostate would have to be taken outside the city and dumped onto unconsecrated ground and left to rot. His closest associates were appalled at the thought, and the king refused to get involved, saying it was the church's problem. So his friends took matters into their own hands, and when the autopsy and embalming was completed, they smuggled the body, minus his heart and a couple of other potential relics, out of the city before the clerics confiscated it. They whisked him away in a coach to the dilapidated abbey of Zaïre, near Troyes, where they convinced the abbot to assist them. They placed him in a makeshift coffin made of rough planks and lifted some flagstones, burying him under the floor of the church. The monks of the abbey conducted the usual requiem masses, and our boy finally got some peace and quiet. When the Archbishop of Paris found out, he went berserk and demanded the body be exhumed, but the abbot, to his credit, held his ground, and Voltaire's remains, for now, stayed put. Fearing a public backlash, the Archbishop quietly relented, and the matter was eventually dropped. Voltaire's body was safe, but hardly resting in style. He would have hated it. By 1790, The French Revolution was in full swing, and appeals were now made to retrieve the body and give it a funeral fitting of a national hero. Orders were issued to the abbey that the body was now the property of the state, and it was solemnly exhumed and transported to Paris with full honours, to lay in state in the Pantheon on the very day that Louis XVI was arrested for trying to flee the country. White horses, chariots, actors dressed in everything from Roman togas to characters from his plays formed a procession all through Paris that celebrated his life and many achievements. He was laid to rest with pomp and ceremony in the crypt of the Pantheon, in a manner he would no doubt finally have approved of. But wait, there's still more. When the Bourbons were reinstalled once again in 1814, following the cancellation of Napoleon's adventures, a group of indignant royalist miscreants snuck into the Pantheon, opened the coffin, and absconded with the remains, scattering them on a rubbish dump outside the city. That'll teach him. Nobody knew until 50 years later a rumour began to surface about what had happened. So the great renovator emperor, Napoleon III, had the tomb opened. It was indeed empty, but the dump site had long since been cleared. The only thing now left of the great man were his literary works, some 15 million words. I kid you not. So what can we say about François-Marie Arouet, the king of clichés, comebacks and one-liners? Like all of us, he was a man of contrasts. His sarcastic wit and flair for writing had him pen verses ranging in breadth and depth from profound scientific research and historical scholarship to jokes, petty diatribes, and potty humour. He popularised the work of Isaac Newton, and by his death was considered the preeminent historian of France, excepting perhaps his bit on Joan of Arc. He corresponded with monarchs, philosophers, and political dissidents, inspiring thousands of thinkers to question their core beliefs and participate in the rising tide of the Enlightenment era. His slow pecking at the monolith of church authority was instrumental in the development of our secular liberal democracies that nevertheless guarantee freedom of personal faith. Religious hardliners and the government hated him for his reformist agenda, yet he believed in the merits of monarchy. He would have been horrified to witness the awful carnage that followed the French Revolution, despite its lofty ideals. He believed in the merits of public education, but only for those who had an aptitude for it. He was a capitalist through and through, but was highly supportive of workers' rights and facilitating opportunities for them to escape poverty and subservience, frequently putting up large sums of his own money to walk the talk. He was a complete hypochondriac who maintained a personal regime of hygiene, exercise, and temperance in his diet, compared to many of his contemporaries. And to top it off, he was a shameless fashionista, but then again, he was a Parisian through and through. Love him or hate him, Europe would never be the same again.